welcome to this week's Thoughtful Thursday. I think Thoughtful Thursdays is one of the days of Everyday Alex that's not changing this week. And for this week's episode, what I wanted to do was to pull together a bunch of different ideas, some of which I've already touched on Everyday Alex, others which I'm planning on exploring more in the future. But to give a little bit of a checklist. So this video is called 7 Keys to Support Healing. And it's not an exhaustive list. There was more to go on the list and I thought this is going to get a bit long for a video. But it's kind of 7 kind of principles or kind of frames of reference of how you're being with yourself and being with your healing journey to ensure that you are kind of covering these ingredients and having these pieces in place. So the first one is commitment. That there has to be responsibility. There's another word we could use of this, but there has to be a sense of being committed to the action of driving our recovery process. This is where I've done previous videos talking about the idea of being captain of the ship of your own recovery. That if recovery is a ship, you've got to be the captain. It doesn't mean you don't have people that know much more than you do about certain functions. So having different practitioners, different people helping you, but ultimately there has to be a commitment and a proactiveness and a taking responsibility. And for those of us that have achiever patterns, there's obviously a way of being with this, which is not just kind of running like, right, I've got to kind of force this whole process. And I will talk to some other qualities that kind of counterbalance this. But ultimately, healing from a chronic illness requires commitment, it requires responsibility, and it requires us to be the captain of the ship of our own recovery. The second of these keys to support healing is we have to be able to ask for help. Even if we are a deeply experienced practitioner ourselves, having external outside perspective is important. That may be practitioner perspective, but also having emotional holding and care and support. That we need, it takes, there's a phrase that I really like, that it takes a village to raise a child. That different people, back in kind of tribal times, different people in that village would perform different functions to help support the development of that child. It takes a team to support the healing process. And for some people, that may be a big team, maybe a small team. It's not about who has the biggest team, because sometimes we can have too many people and it gets too bloated and we need to sometimes kind of trim that back down. But we need to ask for help. And for those of us that have strong helper patterns, we can be very used to helping others, but we need to make sure we're letting others help and support us. And if we've set our life up in such a way that we're always the one giving to others, then there can be a real learning to be able to ask for help and ask for support. The third of these principles is we need to be able to surrender. This is a kind of counterpoint to commitment, that as much as we need to be able to commit and be responsible and to be proactive, we also need to be able to surrender and recognize that we're not in control. What we're trying, it's a bit like being, in fact, to develop the analogy, when you're captain of a ship, you're not in control of the sea. You can't control the waves, you can't control the weather, you have to work with the circumstance you've got. But what you can do is choose how you respond, choose how you set sail, choose when you kind of push forward or when you kind of are holding back. So learning how to let go, how to surrender. Sometimes the best thing we can do if we're having a really challenging or really tough day is just to give up for the day. That doesn't mean we're giving up forever. It doesn't mean we're becoming a victim. It doesn't mean we're going to get swallowed up, although it may feel like that in the moment. But it's being able to say, do you know what? Right now, I don't know all the answers. I don't know any of the answers. I feel completely stuck. And that's okay. It'll feel different later or tomorrow or next week. Or going back to the previous points, I need to get some help. I need to get some outside perspective. So commitment, asking for help, surrender. The fourth is taking time off. This is something that I think people are surprised to hear me say, because I think I have a bit of reputation sometimes of being the kind of, you can do this kind of, not that I'm a motivator in any way, but the kind of like this, I guess I lean heavily on the importance of responsibility and commitment. But I think sometimes people are surprised when I make the point that you also need time off from the recovery journey. It's like someone working 7 days a week, particularly if they're working lots of hours in those days, will eventually burn out. And that's some people watching this video may be watching this because that's what happened. The recovery process, as much as we need to be committed and we need to be responsible and proactive around it, we also need time off from that. That might look like having a kind of action plan that we follow 5 days a week, and 2 days a week are our kind of off days from that process. Now, it's not to say that we then just go and eat completely crap food and completely ignore all of our body's needs, but the more disciplined practices we have in place, that we, even if we just have a reduced expectation on those days. If we're on a nutrition program, there are certain nutrition programs where we do need to really follow it to the letter for a window of time. But normally there's a kind of 80-20 principle of these things, that we also let ourselves go out and enjoy, if we're physically well enough to do that at this point, go and enjoy a nice meal. It doesn't mean that you have to have, the kind of worst options. But if there's a little bit of things you're not meant to be having for a meal, that's also okay. Like that time off, it's just like if someone's in a really intense project. The best thing you can do is sometimes go and take a day or a couple of days off to come back and be fresh to it. Same with the healing path. Now, I know that sometimes the challenge is that when we feel ill all of the time, it's like we can't go and do the things that we used to love to do, perhaps at least for the time being. And so it's like, well, how do you take time off? And maybe that'll be a separate video we can look at. But it can just be as simple as, watching a movie, or lying in a hot bath, or watching a comedy, or whatever it may be. But recognizing that you can't be on the recovery path all the time. You also have to have those times you're being much more gentle and supportive and spacious with yourself. Number 5 is humor. I did one of the first Everyday Alex vlogs that I did was, it wasn't called this, but basically the point was, the more serious we become about our problems, the more serious our problems become. Now, of course, recovery from a chronic illness is a serious business, in as much as there's real suffering that's going on. There's a lot of complexity and nuance. There's the kind of the challenge of the journey that we're on. And we need to learn to be able to laugh at, and so, sometimes the best humor is the really inappropriate humor. There's one of the things that kind of worries me about the real kind of hardcore politically correct movement around what you can say and what you can't say, to the point that there's many comedians in America now have stopped performing at universities because it's become so little you can say without offending someone that it's actually really hard to be funny. And I think sometimes with ourselves, we need to just kind of lighten up a little bit and just, obviously not being cruel and not being unkind to ourselves or others, but having a bit ability to just hold things a bit more lightly, to hold things with a bit more play, with a bit more spaciousness and humor. That can go a very, very long way to calming and settling our nervous system when we're holding on and we're holding things too tightly. Number 6 is the questions that we ask ourselves. Again, this I think this would be a really good separate video, but what am I making this mean? What I mean by that is if we're constantly looking for the negative in our experience, or we're asking questions like, why is this happening to me? Why is life so unfair? Why is my situation so difficult? The way the brain is wired is, if you ask a question, it will try to answer it. So if you ask a question that's deliberately encouraging negative answers, you're going to get a lot of negativity in your internal thinking. So what are the questions you ask yourself, and what do you make your circumstance mean? If we ask better questions, we tend to get better answers. So questions like, what can I learn from this? Questions like, how can I find more joy and connection in even this experience? How can I find a positive in this experience that's happening? And I don't mean to negate and ignore our suffering. I just mean not to make that our ongoing focus. The final one is gratitude. Focus on what you do have. it's an interesting thing where, and I know what I'm about to say is going to really irritate some people, and I apologize. But there's an interesting thing that I've noticed in people that have been recovered for a number of years, looking back on their healing journey. And I include myself in this category as well. And do I look back and miss the years that I was ill? Obviously, I do not. I would not want to live another minute, another day in the kind of suffering and the difficulty of that circumstance. But are there things about that chapter of my life that I look back in a kind of positive way with? Absolutely. The amount of time I had to commit to my own self-development, the fact that I was able to read so many books, I was able to practice meditation for many hours at one point, that I could go to when my energy improved, I could go to a yoga class 5 times a week. That there was a kind of spaciousness and a time for self-care and self-reflection, which at a different chapter in my life, with a busy kind of career and business life and 3 small children and lots of responsibilities, I work hard to carve out the time for self-care. But I have to work hard to carve out the time for self-care. So the gratitude for whatever it is that we can see that we do have, that we can be grateful for. So I think each of these is probably its own video, but I wanted just to put this as a bit of a checklist, that if you're having a challenging time or you're feeling stuck in the healing process, that you can always kind of go through this video and go, which of these could I do some more work to develop? So just to summarize: commitment. How much are you committed to and taking responsibility for your healing journey? Number 2, asking for help. Ask for help. How much are you asking for help and support from others? And could you be doing more of that? Surrender. Are you letting yourself surrender and let go into the experience when you need to, rather than constantly fighting? Do you take time off? Do you take time away from this kind of committed path of recovery that you're on? Is there enough humor? Is there enough lightness and enough play and enough softness? What are you making this mean? What are the questions that you are asking yourself? Can you ask better questions? And could there be more gratitude? Could you focus more on what it is that you do have that you could be grateful for and appreciate? I hope that's been a helpful video. I know there's a lot of content packed in there, but hopefully it's been a helpful checklist. We will go into these themes certainly much more. Tomorrow, it's the new format for Fridays. We're calling it Feel Good Fridays. It's kind of Soul Food Sundays, but on a Friday. And we have an excerpt from my interview with Marie as part of the Fatigue Super Conference. So I look forward to talking with you then.